Sign here, Helen. It's time someone responsible took control. My daughter-in-law slid the leather folder across the polished walnut table as if she were offering me dessert instead of dismantling the last pieces of my life. The conference room at Reeves & Cole overlooked downtown Hartford, all glass walls and gray November rain. But somehow the coldest thing in that room was Claire Whitmore's smile. I looked down at the documents neatly arranged before me. Power of attorney, temporary estate management authorization, financial transfer permissions. My late husband had been buried less than 48 hours earlier, and already they were trying to erase me from the life Richard and I had spent 43 years building together. Ethan sat beside Claire, staring at the table instead of at me. My son looked exhausted in his navy cashmere coat, his shoulders slumped the way they used to when he was a teenager caught lying about something. But this time he wasn't lying to me. He was lying to himself. "Mom," he said quietly, clearing his throat. "This is only temporary until things settle down." Temporary. That word floated through the room like smoke. Temporary was what people called things they never intended to undo. I folded my black gloves carefully into my lap and turned my eyes toward the rain sliding down the windows. Hartford looked colorless that morning. The city lights blurred through the storm, every building fading into another. Richard always loved rainy mornings. He used to stand by our bedroom window holding his coffee cup, saying storms made wealthy people nervous because they reminded them how little control they actually had. I almost smiled thinking about it. Almost. Claire leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice into that polished tone she used whenever she wanted to appear compassionate. "Helen, no one is trying to upset you. But there are businesses involved. Accounts, properties, investors. Richard handled everything, and Ethan shouldn't have to carry this burden alone while you're grieving." I finally looked at her. Claire Whitmore had perfected the art of looking expensive. Her cream-colored blazer probably cost more than my first car. Her blonde hair sat perfectly against her shoulders, not a strand misplaced despite the weather outside. Even her sympathy looked rehearsed. "How thoughtful of you," I said softly. Her expression tightened for half a second before the smile returned. Ethan exhaled hard beside her. "Mom, please don't make this difficult." Difficult. Another interesting word. My husband's funeral flowers were probably still fresh at the cemetery, and already I had become an inconvenience to my own family. Jonathan Reeves, Richard's attorney for nearly 20 years, remained unusually quiet at the far end of the table. He adjusted his glasses once, glanced briefly toward me, then back to the papers. Something about his silence felt intentional. Careful. I noticed Claire noticing it too. "All we need is your signature," she said smoothly. "Then Ethan and I can start organizing things properly." Organizing things properly, meaning the accounts, the trust, the house in Greenwich, the investment properties in Vermont. Richard once joked that wealthy families didn't fight over emotions. They fought over access. I reached for the pen slowly. Ethan finally looked at me then, relief already softening his face. That hurt more than anything else. Not Claire's manipulation, not the legal papers. My son's relief that I seemed ready to surrender. I turned the pen once between my fingers. "Your father hated rushed decisions," I said quietly. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Mom, especially after funerals," I continued gently. Claire crossed one elegant leg over the other. "Helen, with respect, delaying this only complicates matters financially." There it was. Financially. Not emotionally. Not personally. Financially. I lowered my eyes to the signature line. Helen Whitmore. The name looked unfamiliar suddenly, like it belonged to another woman entirely. A weaker woman. An older woman. The kind they thought would sign anything if spoken to softly enough. I signed the first page. Ethan released a breath. Claire's shoulders visibly relaxed. I signed the second page more slowly. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. Jonathan Reeves still said nothing. Claire gathered the papers. Immediately after the final signature, as though afraid I might change my mind. "Good," she said, smiling warmly now. "This is the right thing for everyone." Everyone. Funny how people always used that word when they meant themselves. I placed the pen neatly back onto the table and slipped my gloves on one finger at a time. Then I looked directly at Claire for the first time since entering the room. "You should be very careful with things that don't belong to you," I said calmly. The room went still. Ethan frowned slightly. Claire's smile flickered again, smaller this time. "I'm sorry," she asked lightly. I stood slowly, smoothing the sleeve of my black coat. Nothing, I replied. Just something Richard used to say. Then I walked out of that conference room with steady steps and my head high, while behind me, they gathered papers they believed gave them control over my life. What they didn't understand yet was that Richard Whitmore had never trusted anyone completely, not even family. And 3 nights earlier, before they ever placed those papers in front of me, I had already found the key he left behind. The Whitmore house stopped feeling like mine the morning Claire replaced the lilies. I noticed it the second I walked into the kitchen 3 days before the meeting at Jonathan Reeves's office. Richard always kept white lilies on the marble island because he claimed fresh flowers made a home feel alive, even during difficult seasons. But that morning, the lilies were gone. In their place sat an arrangement of pale orchids in a silver vase I had never seen before. Cold flowers. Decorative flowers. Flowers chosen by someone who cared more about appearances than comfort. Claire stood near the espresso machine, wearing cream silk pajamas and scrolling through her phone as if she had lived in that kitchen forever. "Good morning, Helen," she said without looking up. Helen. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Whitmore anymore. Just Helen. I paused beside the island, resting one hand lightly against the cool marble surface Richard imported from Italy 15 years earlier. "Where are the lilies?" I asked quietly. Claire finally glanced at me. "Oh, they looked wilted," she replied. I thought the kitchen needed something fresher. Something fresher. Strange choice of words after a funeral. I poured myself coffee slowly while rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the back gardens. Connecticut winters always arrived early near the coast. The trees behind the property had already turned brittle and gray, and the fountain Richard built for our 30th anniversary stood silent beneath the clouds. The entire estate felt suspended in some strange stillness, like the house itself was waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Ethan entered a few moments later, adjusting the cuff of his dress shirt while staring down at his phone. He kissed Claire lightly on the cheek before opening the refrigerator. He did not notice the missing lilies. That hurt more than I expected. Richard used to say men only notice what they are afraid to lose. "Morning, Mom," Ethan mumbled distractedly. "I spoke with Jonathan this morning. We may need to review a few estate documents next week." Claire stepped beside him immediately. "There are several things that need organizing," she added smoothly. Richard handled so much privately. I stirred cream into my coffee even though I no longer took cream. Habit. Memory. Grief had a way of turning people into ghosts while they were still alive. "I can review my own documents," I replied calmly. Claire smiled again. Always that polished smile. "Of course you can. We are only trying to help." Help. Another dangerous word wealthy families like to weaponize. Over the next 2 days, the house shifted in ways small enough to sound harmless if spoken aloud. Claire changed the dinner schedule because she said regular meal times were healthier during grief. She canceled my standing hair appointment because she thought I needed rest. She asked the housekeeper to move Richard's study files into storage because looking at paperwork was emotionally overwhelming for me. Even the security gate password changed without anyone mentioning it. Tiny adjustments. Tiny permissions. Tiny erasures. By Thursday evening, I realized I had not made a single decision inside my own home in nearly 48 hours. I found Richard's reading glasses missing from his bedside table that night. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, staring at the empty space beside his favorite novel, while the sound of Claire laughing downstairs drifted faintly through the halls. That room still smelled like Richard's cedar cologne and old leather journals. His navy robe still hung behind the bathroom door exactly where he left it. I had not moved a thing since the night he died. But someone else had started to. I walked downstairs quietly and found Claire directing 2 movers near the east hallway. "What is happening?" I asked. Claire turned with visible surprise, though not embarrassment. "Oh good, you are awake," she said lightly. "I thought it would be easier to clear some unnecessary furniture before the memorial guests arrive this weekend." One of the movers was carrying away the antique writing desk Richard gave me on our 10th anniversary. My stomach tightened. "Put that back," I said calmly. The mover froze immediately. Claire folded her arms gently. "Helen, the desk is damaged and takes up too much space in the hallway." "Put it back," I repeated. For one long moment, neither of us moved. Then Ethan appeared at the top of the staircase wearing sweatpants and exhaustion across his face. "What is going on?" he asked. Claire answered before I could speak. Your mother is upset about the furniture adjustments. Adjustments. Again. Ethan rubbed his forehead heavily. Mom, Claire is only trying to make things easier around here. Easier for whom? I almost asked. Instead, I looked at my son carefully. Really looked at him. Grief had hollowed him out in only a week. Richard's death hit him harder than he admitted. Ethan had always depended on structure, on direction, on stronger personalities making difficult choices for him. Claire understood that better than anyone. She did not control him through cruelty. She controlled him through certainty. That was what made her dangerous. I watched the movers place my desk back against the wall before returning upstairs without another word. Later that night, I sat alone in Richard's study while the grandfather clock ticked softly beside the fireplace. Rain slid against the windows in silver streaks. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk, searching for nothing in particular, and found an envelope tucked beneath an old financial ledger. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Not elegant, not dramatic, just simple block letters. Helen. Inside was a small brass key taped to a folded note. The note contained only one sentence. If Claire starts making decisions for this family, go to the bank immediately. I did not sleep that night. The brass key sat on Richard's desk beside the green banker's lamp while rain pressed softly against the windows, and for the first time since my husband's funeral, my grief began shifting into something colder, more focused. Richard Whitmore was not a dramatic man. In 43 years of marriage, he never raised his voice in anger, never played games, never left vague warnings meant to frighten people. If he left me a note telling me to go to the bank immediately, then he already knew exactly what kind of woman Claire was. That realization hurt more than I expected, not because Richard suspected danger, but because he had prepared for it quietly while trying to protect me from the truth. Around 1 a.m, I finally stood from the desk and crossed the dark hallway toward our bedroom. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the heating system and the grandfather clock downstairs. Halfway down the corridor, I noticed lights spilling beneath the door of Richard's old office library. Claire's voice drifted through softly. "We cannot wait too long," she whispered. I stopped walking immediately. Ethan answered in a lower tone I could barely hear. "I know that. Jonathan already said the estate structure is complicated," Claire continued. "If Helen starts asking questions, this becomes messy." My fingers tightened slightly around the brass key in my robe pocket. Ethan sighed heavily. "She is grieving, Claire." "Exactly," Claire replied smoothly. "Which is why this is the best time to simplify things before she becomes emotionally attached to decisions she does not understand." Emotionally attached to my own life. I stood completely still outside the partially closed door, while something inside me settled into certainty. Claire did not see me as family. She saw me as an obstacle. Once the temporary authority transfers are signed, everything becomes easier, Claire continued. The accounts, the properties, the board access. Board access. That caught my attention immediately. Richard's commercial real estate company still held controlling interests in 3 development firms across Connecticut and New York. Ethan worked within the business, but he never handled executive decisions directly. Richard always believed Ethan lacked the temperament for leadership. Apparently Claire disagreed. Or perhaps she simply believed she could lead through him. Ethan spoke again, quieter this time. "I just do not want this turning into some ugly family conflict." Claire's voice softened instantly. "Neither do I. I am trying to protect you." Protect you. Another weapon disguised as love. I stepped away from the hallway before they could notice me and returned upstairs silently. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the mattress staring at the rain sliding down the windows while memories I had ignored for years slowly rearranged themselves into something far uglier. Claire always insisted on attending Richard's business dinners. Claire encouraged Ethan to push for larger involvement in company decisions despite having little experience. Claire once asked unusually specific questions about our estate structure during a Christmas party 2 years earlier, then laughed it off when Richard changed the subject. At the time, I assumed she was simply ambitious. Now I realized ambition was only the surface. Richard saw it too. That was why he left the key. The next morning, Claire behaved as though nothing had happened. She sat at the breakfast table in a pale gray sweater reading financial news on her tablet while sunlight finally broke through the clouds outside. Ethan had already left for Manhattan for meetings related to the company. "You seem tired," Claire observed casually as I entered the kitchen. I poured myself coffee carefully. I did not sleep much. That is understandable, she replied smoothly. Grief can affect memory and concentration too. You should be careful not to overwhelm yourself with paperwork right now. There it was again. Small suggestions, small implications, planting weakness quietly enough that it sounded compassionate. I stirred my coffee slowly while studying her reflection in the kitchen windows. You seem very concerned about my paperwork, I said calmly. Claire smiled without hesitation. Richard trusted Ethan and me to help take care of things. Trusted. Another interesting word. Richard trusted very few people completely. I knew that better than anyone. Around noon, Martha Bennett arrived unexpectedly. She had been my closest friend since college, long before either of us married wealthy men and learned how expensive appearances could become. Martha walked into the house wearing a camel wool coat and carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe near the harbor. The second Claire saw her, something in her expression tightened almost invisibly. Good. Martha hugged me tightly in the foyer before glancing toward Claire. I was hoping to borrow Helen for lunch, she said pleasantly. Claire hesitated only a second. Of course, she replied. Just do not tire her out. Martha waited until we were halfway down the driveway before speaking again. Richard called me 3 months ago, she said quietly. I turned toward her immediately. About Claire. Martha nodded once. He thought she was pushing Ethan too aggressively into company control. He said she kept asking questions about trusts, ownership structures, succession rights. Cold air drifted off the Long Island Sound as we walked slowly toward Martha's car. Why did he not tell me? I asked softly. Martha looked at me carefully. Because Richard believed you still saw Ethan as your little boy. He did not think you wanted to know who your son had become around her. That sentence stayed with me the entire drive into town. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. By the time Martha dropped me outside the Whitmore National Bank building an hour later, the brass key in my coat pocket no longer felt mysterious. It felt heavy, important, like the beginning of something Richard had planned long before any of us realized the game had already started. Whitmore National Bank occupied the corner of Madison Avenue and Harbor Street like an old fortress that refused to apologize for its wealth. Richard loved that building because it still believed in privacy. No bright advertising screens. No self-service kiosks. Just polished marble floors, dark wood counters, and employees who understood that old money survived by speaking softly. Martha squeezed my hand briefly before I stepped out of her car. Call me the second you leave, she said quietly. I nodded once and closed the door behind me. The brass key rested heavily inside my coat pocket as I crossed the sidewalk beneath the cold Connecticut wind. Inside the bank, everything smelled faintly of leather, paper, and expensive cologne. A young receptionist greeted me immediately, though her smile shifted the moment she recognized my name. Mrs. Whitmore, she said softly. I am very sorry for your loss. Thank you, I replied calmly. I need access to a private deposit box. She glanced toward her computer screen. Of course. Mr. Whitmore maintains several secure holdings here. One moment, please. Several. Interesting. Richard never discussed numbers openly, even with me. That was how he survived decades in commercial real estate without becoming reckless. He believed privacy was a form of armor. A few minutes later, an older bank manager named Harold Simmons appeared from behind the offices carrying a small leather folder. Harold had known Richard nearly 30 years. His silver tie was perfectly straight, but his eyes carried the uncomfortable expression of someone who knew more than he wanted to say. Mrs. Whitmore, he greeted gently. Richard spoke very highly of you. That is kind of him, I answered. Harold lowered his voice slightly. Your husband left very specific instructions regarding one of his secured accounts. Instructions that only became active under particular circumstances. I looked at him carefully. What circumstances? Harold hesitated. If anyone besides you attempted to assume control over the family trust within 30 days of his death. For a moment, I simply stared at him while the sounds of quiet banking activity continued around us. A printer humming, phones ringing softly, expensive shoes crossing marble floors. Richard knew, not suspected. Knew. Harold gestured toward a private hallway. Please come with me. The secure vault sat beneath the main floor behind thick steel doors that looked heavy enough to survive a hurricane. Harold entered a code while another employee verified my identification. Every step felt strangely unreal, as though I were walking deeper into a version of my marriage I had never fully understood. Inside the vault room, rows of deposit boxes lined the walls beneath low golden lighting. Harold stopped before a larger black security case positioned separately from the others. This was placed under restricted authorization 6 months ago, he explained quietly. Richard instructed us personally that only you could open it using your key. 6 months ago, long before Richard became sick, long before the funeral, long before Claire began rearranging my life room by room. My fingers felt colder than the brass key as I inserted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked softly. Harold stepped back immediately to give me privacy. Inside the security box sat 3 things. A sealed envelope with my name written across the front, a dark blue folder stamped Whitmore Family Trust, and a flash drive resting beside a silver fountain pen Richard used for every major business contract during our marriage. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope first. Helen, if you are reading this, then Claire moved faster than I hoped she would. That was the first sentence. Not emotional, not sentimental. Pure Richard. Direct and careful. I sat slowly in the leather chair beside the vault table and continued reading. I know you love Ethan enough to excuse things that should concern you. That is why I handled this quietly. Claire has been pressuring Ethan toward control of the company for over a year. I allowed certain conversations to continue because I needed proof of her intentions before changing the trust structure permanently. I stopped breathing for a moment. Proof. Richard had been investigating his own family while sitting across from them at Sunday dinners. The letter continued. 3 months ago, Claire attempted to gain indirect access to executive holding accounts through Ethan. She believes ownership transfers automatically upon my death. They do not. I restructured everything under your authority alone. No property, company shares, or liquid assets can be transferred without your direct approval. If Claire pressures you emotionally after my funeral, do not confront her immediately. Let her believe she has already won. That sentence lingered in my mind long after I finished reading it. Let her believe she has already won. Slowly, I opened the blue trust folder next. Inside sat copies of revised ownership documents, corporate control agreements, and legal directives signed by Richard and Jonathan Reeves less than 2 months earlier. Every major Whitmore holding now belonged entirely to a protected family trust controlled solely by me. Ethan had beneficiary status only after my death. Not before. Claire had no access whatsoever. Not legally. Not financially. Not unless I allowed it. Suddenly, the meeting at Jonathan Reeves's office looked completely different in my mind. Claire sliding papers toward me. Claire pushing temporary authority transfers. Claire rushing signatures before I could fully understand what Richard had changed. She was not trying to help organize the estate. She was trying to bypass it. Harold cleared his throat gently from across the room. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, there is something else you should know. I looked up slowly. Harold's expression had hardened into something almost sympathetic. 2 days after Richard passed away, Mrs. Claire Whitmore contacted the bank requesting emergency access authorization to several restricted family accounts. My stomach tightened. On what grounds? Harold hesitated again. She stated you were emotionally unstable and potentially incapable of managing financial decisions safely after your husband's death. For a few seconds, the vault room became completely silent around me. Then I folded Richard's letter carefully back into the envelope and smiled for the first time since the funeral. Not because I felt happy, because suddenly everything became very clear. By the time Martha drove me back to the Whitmore estate that afternoon, the rain had stopped and the sky over Connecticut had turned the pale silver color that always came before winter. I sat quietly in the passenger seat with Richard's letter folded inside my handbag and watched bare tree branches move against the clouds. For the first time since his funeral, I no longer felt lost. Hurt, yes. Angry, certainly. But not lost. Richard had already drawn the battlefield for me. All I had to do now was stop behaving like prey. What are you going to do? Martha asked softly as she turned into the long stone driveway leading toward the house. The estate stood at the top of the hill exactly as it always had. Massive white columns, black shutters, warm lights glowing through the tall windows facing the harbor. To outsiders, it probably looked like stability, wealth, legacy. But now I understood something Richard learned years ago. Beautiful homes could hide very ugly intentions. Nothing yet, I replied calmly. Martha frowned slightly. Helen, Claire tried to declare you mentally unstable to access the accounts. I know. And you are still planning to stay quiet? I turned toward her slowly. Richard specifically told me to let her believe she already won. Martha studied my face for a long moment before nodding once. You sound different. I am different. Because grief changes shape when betrayal enters the room. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front entrance with slow, steady steps. Through the dining room windows, I could already see Claire moving around inside, arranging candles across the long mahogany table, preparing another performance. The second I entered the foyer, Claire appeared wearing soft beige cashmere and concern carefully arranged across her face. Helen, she said warmly. I was getting worried. Your phone went straight to voicemail. I removed my gloves calmly. The battery died. Not entirely true. I turned the phone off deliberately the moment Harold Simmons told me Claire contacted the bank behind my back. Claire tilted her head slightly. You should not disappear like that right now. Ethan was concerned. Ethan entered from Richard's study almost immediately after hearing his name. He looked exhausted again, tie loosened, dark circles beneath his eyes. My son had spent most of his adult life trying to avoid conflict. Unfortunately, that made him very easy to lead by someone who enjoyed creating it. Mom, he said quietly. Where were you? Out. Claire stepped closer before he could continue. We were discussing some options that might help reduce stress for everyone. There it was. Options. Such polite language for taking control of another person's life. I handed my coat to the housekeeper and walked slowly toward the dining room. What kind of options? Claire followed beside me. Nothing immediate, she said smoothly. But Ethan and I thought perhaps a temporary change of environment could help while you recover emotionally. Recover emotionally. I almost admired how carefully she phrased everything. Claire found a beautiful assisted living property near Greenwich, Ethan added awkwardly. Just for a few months maybe. Somewhere peaceful. I stopped beside the dining table and looked down at Richard's silver candle holders reflecting warm light across the polished wood surface. Assisted living. Less than 1 week after my husband's funeral. How efficient, I said quietly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Mom, it is not like that. Then what is it like? Neither of them answered immediately. Claire finally pulled out a chair and sat gracefully across from me. Helen, this house is enormous. The responsibilities are overwhelming even under normal circumstances. You should not have to manage all of this alone at your age. At your age? Another subtle cut disguised as compassion. I folded my hands carefully in front of me. Richard never seemed concerned about my age. Claire's smile tightened for barely a second. Richard also shielded you from many complicated realities. That sentence told me everything. Claire truly believed Richard handled me the same way she handled Ethan. Like someone fragile, manageable, easy to direct. Poor Claire. She never understood the difference between kindness and weakness. Dinner that evening felt strangely calm. Claire discussed catering arrangements for the memorial luncheon while Ethan stared down at financial reports spread beside his plate. I listened quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking small questions that encouraged them to speak more openly. Richard was right again. The moment people believe they control the room, they stop guarding their intentions. The Manhattan investors are nervous, Ethan admitted at one point. Without a clear transition structure, the board may start questioning leadership. Claire reached for his hand immediately, which is why temporary authority paperwork matters so much. Temporary authority. Such an innocent phrase for a legal trap. I sipped my wine slowly while studying my son's face. Ethan truly believed he was protecting the family business. That was the tragedy of it. Claire manipulated him through fear, not greed. Fear of failure. Fear of disappointing his father even after death. Fear of losing control before he ever truly had it. Later that night, after the staff cleared dinner and Ethan retreated to his office upstairs, Claire stopped me near the staircase. I know this is difficult for you, she said softly. But eventually, every family reaches a point where the next generation has to take over. I looked at her quietly beneath the warm chandelier light. Claire's expression remained perfectly composed, but I noticed something new underneath it now. Impatience. She thought I was almost finished. Almost weak enough. Almost ready to surrender the rest. You may be right, I answered gently. Relief flashed through her eyes so quickly she could not hide it. I am glad you understand. I smiled then. Small. Calm. Controlled. The exact kind of smile Richard used during negotiations when the other side accidentally revealed too much. "Claire," I said softly, "do you know the most dangerous mistake people make around old families?" Her expression flickered slightly. "What?" I adjusted the sleeve of my black silk blouse carefully before answering. "They assume the quiet person in the room does not understand the game." Then I walked upstairs without another word, while behind me the entire house settled into silence. The strangest thing about betrayal is how quickly it becomes routine once people think you stopped resisting. By Friday morning, Claire moved through the Whitmore estate with the confidence of someone already redecorating a house she believed belonged to her. She spoke to staff without consulting me. She reorganized schedules. She answered calls meant for Richard's office before anyone else could reach them. And because I no longer questioned her openly, she became careless. Richard understood human nature better than anyone I ever met. Give ambitious people the illusion of victory, and eventually they stop hiding their hunger. I sat in the sunroom overlooking the harbor that morning wrapped in a pale gray cashmere shawl, while Claire discussed floral arrangements for the memorial luncheon with a catering manager. The room smelled faintly of garden roses and espresso. Beyond the windows, sailboats drifted slowly across the cold November water beneath low silver clouds. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful. White orchids would feel more modern, Claire was saying while flipping through sample photographs. The traditional arrangements are too heavy. Traditional. Another thing she disliked. Richard always insisted memorials should feel warm, personal, dignified. Claire preferred everything sleek and controlled, like a luxury hotel lobby. She noticed me watching her and softened her voice immediately. "What do you think, Helen?" I looked down at the photographs in her hands. None of them looked like Richard. "Whatever you think is best," I answered quietly. The satisfaction in her eyes disappeared almost instantly behind sympathy. "I know this is difficult for you," she said gently. "You do not need to worry about these details anymore." Anymore. Such a dangerous little word. Ethan entered the room carrying his laptop and 2 cell phones, both ringing within seconds of each other. He looked exhausted again. My son had not slept properly since Richard died. His grief was becoming buried beneath pressure, and Claire knew exactly how to use that. "The investors from Boston want another conference call this afternoon," he muttered while rubbing his forehead. "They are nervous about leadership continuity." Claire stood immediately and touched his arm reassuringly. "Once temporary authority transfers finalize, this uncertainty settles down." Temporary authority again. The phrase appeared in nearly every conversation now, repeated so often it almost sounded harmless. Ethan sighed heavily. "Jonathan says there are still procedural delays." Claire's expression tightened slightly. "Only because certain signatures took longer than expected." She glanced toward me for barely half a second. There it was. The first real crack in her composure. Impatience. I lowered my eyes toward my untouched tea. "I am sorry if my grief created inconvenience," I said softly. Ethan looked guilty immediately. "Mom, that is not what anyone means." Claire stepped in before he could continue. "Helen, no one blames you. We are all trying to protect this family." Protect this family. The irony almost made me smile. Instead, I reached slowly for my teacup with slightly trembling hands. Not entirely fake. Grief still lived inside me like cold weather settling into old bones. Claire noticed the tremor instantly. "You should rest upstairs today," she said carefully. "You seem overwhelmed." I nodded faintly. "Perhaps you are right." Her eyes softened with quiet victory. That afternoon, I deliberately stayed out of every conversation involving finances, lawyers, or business calls. I allowed Claire to explain things to staff without interruption. I even asked her twice where certain household records were located, pretending confusion I no longer felt. Each small surrender made her bolder. By evening, she had started speaking about the future openly in front of me. "The Manhattan apartment will probably need renovations before spring," she told Ethan casually during dinner. "And the Greenwich property taxes are ridiculous for a house this size." The Greenwich property. My home. Not yet, Claire. Not even close. Ethan barely looked up from the financial spreadsheets spread across the dining table. "We can figure all that out later." "Later becomes expensive," Claire replied smoothly. "Especially if your mother eventually decides she wants to downsize voluntarily." Voluntarily. Another carefully chosen word. I cut a small piece of salmon slowly while studying my son's tired face beneath the chandelier light. Ethan looked trapped between exhaustion and dependence. Claire had become his certainty, his structure, his translator for complicated situations. Richard once warned me that some people do not seek power directly. They seek exhausted people because exhausted people stop questioning who is leading them. After dinner, I excused myself early and returned upstairs while Claire and Ethan remained below discussing investor concerns. Halfway down the hallway, I paused beside the upstairs balcony overlooking the foyer. Their voices carried upward faintly through the quiet house. "She is giving in faster than I expected," Claire whispered. Ethan sounded uneasy. "Do not say it like that. I mean emotionally," Claire corrected smoothly. "Helen clearly cannot manage all of this alone." Ethan exhaled heavily. "I just hate feeling like we are taking things away from her." Claire's voice softened immediately. "Ethan, listen to me. We are stabilizing the family before things collapse financially. Your father built an empire. Someone has to protect it. Protect it." Again, she always framed control as responsibility. It was clever because Ethan needed to believe he was helping rather than betraying. I returned quietly to my bedroom and closed the door behind me. Then I crossed toward Richard's closet and opened the hidden compartment behind his old cedar watch case, exactly where he once showed me decades earlier during a thunderstorm when we were still young enough to think secrets were romantic. Inside sat another envelope, smaller this time, my name written across the front again in Richard's handwriting. I opened it slowly beneath the bedside lamp. Inside was a single photograph. Claire standing beside a man I did not recognize outside a Manhattan restaurant 6 months earlier. They were holding legal documents. On the back, Richard had written only one sentence. "He is the attorney she consulted before trying to remove you from the trust." The memorial luncheon took place on Sunday beneath gray Connecticut skies and carefully rehearsed sympathy. Black luxury cars lined the circular driveway while men in dark wool coats discussed market uncertainty in lowered voices near the harbor-facing terrace. Inside the Whitmore estate, waiters carried silver trays through rooms filled with politicians, investors, attorneys, and old family acquaintances who had known Richard long enough to understand two things about him. He trusted very few people, and he always planned further ahead than everyone else in the room. Claire moved through the house gracefully in a fitted black dress with pearls at her throat, accepting condolences as though she had already inherited the Whitmore legacy personally. Every detail of the luncheon reflected her taste instead of Richard's. White orchids instead of lilies. Champagne instead of bourbon. Modern piano music drifting softly through the ballroom instead of the old jazz records Richard loved on Sunday afternoons. She was redesigning his memory in real time. And because I stayed quiet, almost no one noticed. That was the beauty of silence. People stop looking at you once they decide you are defeated. I stood near the library windows holding a cup of untouched tea while guests approached one by one to offer polished condolences. Richard was extraordinary. You must be devastated. Claire has done such a beautiful job organizing everything. That last comment appeared more often than the others. Claire noticed it too. Every compliment fed her confidence a little more. Around 3 o'clock, I spotted Jonathan Reeves arriving through the front foyer carrying his leather briefcase. Claire crossed the room toward him almost immediately. Her smile looked warm, but I recognized calculation beneath it now. She led him quietly toward Richard's study, touching his arm lightly while speaking in low tones. Jonathan's expression remained carefully neutral. Interesting. Very interesting. Ethan joined them moments later, his face tense with exhaustion. I watched the study door close behind all three of them. Then I turned slowly toward the harbor outside the windows while pretending not to notice. 20 minutes later, Ethan emerged alone looking pale and distracted. He walked directly toward me carrying a glass of whiskey he had barely touched. "Mom," he said softly, "Jonathan may want another family meeting tomorrow regarding the estate documents." "Another meeting?" I asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Just procedural things. Temporary authority extensions. Company access issues. Investor concerns." Investor concerns again. Claire appeared beside him almost instantly, elegant and composed as always. "Nothing stressful," she assured me gently. "Jonathan simply wants to avoid delays while everyone is still gathered in town." I looked between them calmly. Of course. Claire studied my face carefully, searching for resistance that never appeared. "You have been handling all of this remarkably well," she said. "Honestly, I expected much more confusion after losing Richard." There it was again. Confusion, memory, emotional instability. She kept planting the same narrative repeatedly because she needed witnesses to absorb it naturally. Richard saw that months ago. The realization no longer hurt. Now it simply sharpened my attention. As the afternoon continued, conversations grew looser beneath expensive wine and grief softened by social performance. Near sunset, I stepped onto the terrace for air and found two board members from Whitmore Commercial Holdings speaking quietly near the stone railing overlooking the water. They stopped talking the second they noticed me. One of them, Thomas Ridley, offered an awkward smile. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I was just telling Charles how strong Claire has been through all of this." Strong. Another dangerous word. "She certainly has opinions," I replied calmly. Thomas hesitated before lowering his voice slightly. "Between us, many investors feel reassured knowing Ethan and Claire are stepping into leadership quickly. Stability matters." Stability. That was Claire's real strategy. Move fast enough that everyone accepted her control before anyone questioned whether she had the right to it. I smiled politely and returned inside without another word. Later that evening, after most guests left and the house finally quieted, Claire poured herself a glass of red wine and sat across from Ethan at the dining room table, surrounded by stacks of estate papers and investor files. They looked almost relaxed for the first time all week. Victorious, even. I entered quietly, wearing one of Richard's old navy cashmere sweaters, and paused near the doorway. Claire glanced up with immediate sympathy already arranged across her face. "You should really be resting," she said softly. "Long days like this can become overwhelming." I sat slowly at the head of the table where Richard always sat during family dinners. "I wanted to thank you both for handling so much this week," I said quietly. Ethan looked relieved immediately. Claire's shoulders loosened almost invisibly. "You do not need to thank us," she replied. "We are family." Family. Such a beautiful word when spoken honestly. Such an ugly one when used strategically. Ethan rubbed his tired eyes. "Tomorrow may finally settle everything legally." Claire reached for his hand beneath the chandelier light. "After that, things can start feeling normal again." Normal, meaning controlled, managed, finished. I folded my hands carefully atop the polished mahogany table and looked around the dining room slowly. Richard's silver candlesticks reflected soft golden light across the walls. Family portraits still lined the shelves exactly where I placed them years earlier. Ethan at 12 holding a fishing rod beside his father. Christmas mornings in Vermont. Summer parties on the harbor lawn. Entire decades built quietly inside these rooms by two people who once believed love alone could protect a family from ambition. Claire followed my gaze toward the photographs and smiled gently. "Richard would want everyone moving forward together," she said. I looked directly at her then. Would he? For one brief second, the room became completely still. Claire's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Ethan frowned slightly. Then Claire smiled again, smooth and effortless. "Of course." I returned the smile calmly. Small. Controlled. The exact kind of smile that makes intelligent people uncomfortable because they cannot tell whether you already know something they do not. Upstairs, hidden inside Richard's study desk beneath locked financial records, sat copies of every document Claire believed she manipulated successfully. And tomorrow morning, Jonathan Reeves was finally going to discover that I had seen them first. The next morning arrived cold and bright. The kind of sharp Connecticut morning where the harbor looked almost metallic beneath the winter sun. I woke before dawn and sat alone in Richard's study wearing one of his old wool cardigans while the house remained silent around me. On the desk beside my coffee sat three things. Richard's handwritten letter, the photograph of Claire with the Manhattan attorney, and copies of every trust amendment Jonathan Reeves finalized 2 months before Richard died. I ran my fingers slowly across Richard's fountain pen and thought about the last conversation we had in this room 6 weeks earlier. He had been standing near the fireplace holding a crystal glass of bourbon while watching snow begin to fall outside the windows. "Promise me something," he said quietly back then. I looked up from the financial magazine in my lap. "What?" Richard smiled faintly. "If anyone ever mistakes your kindness for weakness, do not interrupt them." At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I understood he was talking about family. Downstairs, I could already hear Claire directing staff before 7 in the morning. Her heels crossed marble floors with the confidence of someone who believed the future belonged to her. By 8:30, Jonathan Reeves arrived carrying his leather briefcase and wearing the careful expression of a man walking into a complicated negotiation. Ethan joined us in the library shortly afterward, looking tense and exhausted again. Claire entered last, wearing a cream-colored suit and carrying a folder filled with documents. She looked polished, prepared, victorious. "Thank you all for making time this morning," Jonathan began carefully as everyone settled around the long table beneath Richard's oil portraits. "There are still several estate matters requiring clarification." Claire folded her hands elegantly atop her folder. "Primarily temporary operational authority," she added smoothly. "The investors are becoming increasingly nervous." Jonathan glanced toward her briefly before turning back to me. "Mrs. Whitmore, before we proceed, I would like to review the documents you signed at my office earlier this week." I nodded calmly. "Of course." Ethan leaned forward immediately. "Jonathan, can we please finalize this today? Everyone is exhausted." Claire touched his arm reassuringly. "We are close." Close. Yes, they were. Just not in the direction they imagined. Jonathan opened his briefcase slowly and removed several legal folders. Then something unexpected happened. He looked directly at Claire. Before continuing, he said carefully, "I need clarification regarding unauthorized attempts to access restricted Whitmore trust accounts 2 days after Richard Whitmore's death." The room went still instantly. Claire blinked once. Only once. "I am sorry," she asked smoothly. Jonathan removed a document from the folder. "Whitmore National Bank notified me yesterday afternoon that you contacted them requesting emergency authority access based on claims regarding Mrs. Whitmore's emotional instability." Ethan turned toward Claire immediately. "What?" Claire recovered quickly. "Jonathan, that was completely misunderstood. I was only trying to prevent delays if Helen became overwhelmed." Jonathan's expression remained neutral. The request specifically referenced concerns about diminished mental capacity. Ethan stared at his wife in confusion. "Claire," she looked at him softly. "Ethan, your father's death happened suddenly. I was trying to protect the company while your mother grieved." "Protect. Always protect." I sat quietly at the end of the table watching the room shift around her for the first time. Tiny changes. Tiny fractures. Ethan's uncertainty. Jonathan's distance. Claire sensed it immediately. "Surely we are not turning responsible preparation into something inappropriate," she continued calmly. "Everyone here knows Helen has struggled emotionally this week." I finally spoke then. Quietly. "Emotionally unstable people generally do not spend an afternoon reviewing trust law at Whitmore National Bank." Claire froze completely. Not dramatically. Just enough. Ethan looked between us immediately. Jonathan slowly removed his glasses. "You went to the bank?" he asked me carefully. "Richard left instructions," I replied. Then I opened the leather folder beside me and slid copies of the revised trust documents across the table one by one. Silence settled over the library like snowfall. Ethan stared down at the pages first, then again more carefully. "Mom." Jonathan picked up the documents immediately, scanning the signatures and dates with visible surprise. "These are the finalized amendments Richard requested before his death," he said slowly. Claire's composure cracked for the first time all week. "That is impossible." I looked directly at her. "No. What is impossible is transferring ownership of assets that legally do not belong to you." Ethan looked pale now. "What does this mean?" Jonathan placed the documents down carefully. "It means every major Whitmore holding was transferred into a protected family trust controlled solely by your mother." Claire spoke instantly. "Richard would never completely cut Ethan out." "He did not," I replied calmly. "Ethan remains beneficiary after my death." Ethan leaned back heavily in his chair, while understanding slowly spread across his face. "You knew," he whispered toward Claire. Claire's eyes flashed toward him immediately. "Ethan, listen to me." "You knew," he repeated. Jonathan cleared his throat carefully. "There is more." Everyone turned toward him. Jonathan removed another document from his briefcase. Richard also requested an internal review of any legal consultations involving attempts to challenge Helen Whitmore's trust authority before his death. Claire went completely still. Jonathan continued quietly. Yesterday evening, I confirmed that a Manhattan attorney was contacted 6 months ago regarding possible removal strategies involving Mrs. Whitmore from trust leadership. Ethan looked at his wife like he no longer recognized her. Claire. She stood abruptly from the table. This is absurd. But her voice no longer sounded polished. It sounded cornered. Finally, I folded my hands calmly atop the polished wood table Richard imported from London 20 years earlier and watched the silence settle around her. Then I smiled. Slightly. The same restrained smile Richard used whenever negotiations ended exactly the way he predicted they would. You were right about one thing, Claire, I said softly. This family does need protection. No one spoke for several seconds after I finished talking. The silence inside Richard's library felt heavier than grief now. It felt like truth finally entering a room that spent too long decorated with performance. Claire remained standing beside the table, one hand gripping the back of the leather chair so tightly her knuckles lost color. Ethan looked caught somewhere between shock and humiliation, while Jonathan Reeves quietly reorganized the legal documents spread before him. Outside the tall windows, cold afternoon light stretched across the harbor in pale silver lines. The Whitmore estate had never looked more beautiful, or more fragile. Claire recovered first, of course. Women like her always do. Ethan, she said carefully, softening her voice again. Your mother is manipulating the situation emotionally because she feels threatened. I almost admired the consistency. Even cornered, Claire still reached for the same strategy. Make me look unstable. Make herself look reasonable. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. You went behind my mother's back. I was trying to secure your future, Claire replied immediately. Your father never trusted you with enough responsibility because Helen convinced him you were weak. That sentence landed harder than she intended. Ethan flinched visibly. For the first time all week, I saw something shift inside my son. Not anger. Not even betrayal. Recognition. The painful recognition that someone had been quietly feeding his insecurities for years and calling it support. Jonathan removed his glasses slowly. Claire, he said carefully, I strongly advise you to stop speaking. She ignored him completely. Richard spent his entire life controlling everyone around him. She continued, turning toward Ethan. And now your mother plans to do the same thing. I stood then. Slowly. Calmly. The room became silent again immediately. No, I said softly. Richard spent his life protecting what he built from people who mistook access for entitlement. Claire laughed once under her breath. Sharp. Nervous. You really think you won something today? She asked. I looked at her quietly for a moment before answering. No, Claire. I think Richard already won this months ago. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the table. Did you ever actually believe in me? He asked her suddenly. Claire froze. That question mattered more than the trust. More than the money. More than the estate. Because once trust disappears inside a marriage, every conversation that came before it starts sounding different. Ethan, she said carefully, stepping closer toward him. Everything I did was for us. Was it? He whispered. Claire reached for his arm, but he stepped back slightly. Small movement. Huge fracture. Jonathan finally closed the legal folders in front of him. Given the circumstances, he said professionally, all temporary authority requests are now suspended permanently. Mrs. Whitmore retains sole legal control over all trust holdings and executive company authority exactly as Richard intended. Claire's face hardened completely then. The polished sympathy vanished. The carefully rehearsed concern disappeared with it. What remained underneath was colder. This family will collapse without proper leadership, she said quietly. I almost smiled. And yet somehow it survived 71 years before you arrived. She stared at me with open resentment now, no longer bothering to hide it. Good. Masks become heavy eventually. You think money makes you powerful, Claire said. No. I answered calmly. Experience does. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 4 softly through the silence. Ethan looked exhausted. Older somehow. Like the last week had finally caught up to him all at once. Mom, he said quietly without looking at me. I did not know about any of this. That hurt because I believed him. Ethan knew Claire pushed aggressively. He knew she controlled conversations. He knew she moved too fast after Richard died. But he did not know she tried to remove me legally before the funeral flowers were even gone. I walked slowly toward him across the library carpet Richard imported from London 20 years earlier. I know, I said softly. Ethan finally looked up at me then, eyes red from exhaustion and shame. I should have protected you. I studied my son carefully. The little boy who used to wait at the front window every evening for Richard to come home from work. The teenager who cried after his first heartbreak and pretended he had allergies. The grown man who spent so much time trying to become strong that he stopped noticing when someone stronger was quietly steering his entire life. You were grieving too, I replied gently. Claire looked between us with growing panic now. Not because of the money, because control was slipping. Fast. Ethan, she said sharply, we need to leave. But Ethan did not move immediately. That frightened her more than anything else. Jonathan gathered his briefcase quietly while staff moved silently through distant parts of the house beyond the library doors. Somewhere upstairs, wind rattled softly against the harbor-facing windows. The Whitmore estate felt different suddenly. Lighter, as if Richard himself had finally stopped holding his breath. Claire grabbed her handbag from the chair beside her with tight, controlled movements. This is not over, she said coldly before turning toward the door. No, I replied calmly. It is. She paused for one final second without looking back. Then she walked out of the library in sharp, measured steps that echoed through the marble hallway until the front door finally closed behind her. Silence settled over the room again. Ethan sat heavily in the leather chair across from me while Jonathan finished organizing the remaining legal documents. Outside, snow had started falling lightly over the harbor. Winter arriving at last. I walked toward the windows slowly and looked out across the water where Richard once taught Ethan to sail when he was only 8 years old. The world beyond the glass looked pale and quiet and honest. Behind me, Ethan's voice sounded smaller than I had heard in years. Can you ever forgive me? I rested one hand lightly against the cold window pane before answering. You did not lose this house today, Ethan. I turned toward him slowly. You lost the mother who would have given you everything without being asked. Then I walked out of the library with steady steps, while behind me Richard's empire remained exactly where it belonged.